Well, conflict and political crisis in Myanmar is one of the priority affairs during the Indonesia's ASEAN Chairmanship in 2023 by pushing for the implementation of ASEAN's five-point consensus. And however, Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, said that Indonesia's leadership in ASEAN has so far not provided significant results on the issues faced by Myanmar and also the group itself. And joining us to delve deeper into this topic here in the studio is the researcher from the Department of International Relations of CSIS, Andrew Wiguna Mantong. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me here in the studio.
You're most welcome.
Right. So the 42nd ASEAN Summit in Labuan Bajo has just come to an end a couple of days ago, if not a week. Final statement has been released by President of Indonesia Joko Widodo, further highlighting ASEAN's efforts to tackle the Myanmar issue. Do you see that the deliverables, the outcomes of the 42nd ASEAN Summit was a successful and constructive step towards a betterment of ASEAN?
Well, I think there are 2 points in your question. First, whether it is successful, and second, whether it is constructive. Whether it is successful, I think it can be assessed by, logistically speaking, that the event was wonderful and everybody was happy about that. But in terms of being constructive, we still have not seen some important issues being tackled by ASEAN. And if you assume that the world is okay, it is actually successful. But if you assume that the world is changing, that there are so many problems that needs to be tackled, including the geopolitical rivalry, including that also has been touching the issues on economics today, and also the problem of Myanmar. I think there are a lot of homework that the Indonesian government has to tackle in the following months, especially for the second summit of the year during the chairmanship. And some of the issues are related to the fact whether ASEAN is equipped enough to deal with geopolitical competition, and whether ASEAN is quite bold and visionary in dealing with the Myanmar crisis today.
Right. Echoing on what you just said, Andrew, indeed, President Joko Widodo, during the opening remarks of the summit, mentions these prominent issues, pressing matters for ASEAN: the rising tensions of two big economies, the Myanmar issues, the inflation economy, as you said, and also human trafficking. However, not all of those things were addressed at the final press conference, the presser event of the ASEAN. However, let's highlight first the Myanmar issue, as I mentioned at the beginning. Do you think that the non-megaphone diplomacy, or rather the quiet diplomacy that has been pushed by the Indonesian government through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in a way the most effective, or the only way we can tread the water through ASEAN for resolving the issue of Myanmar, do you think?
Well, with regards to the Myanmar issues, quiet diplomacy has been necessary from the very beginning. It has to be quiet diplomacy since the coup happened. So that was not special in terms of making any progress in dealing with Myanmar
That was
issues.
already in 2021, the initial coup in Myanmar. And we've gone over
That's
2
true.
years now with no significant progress on the 5 points of consensus, Andrew.
Yes, that's the problem with ASEAN now. I think if we can refer to the statement made by the ASEAN Foreign Minister retreat in early February, it has been believed that for Indonesian government or for Indonesian chairmanship today, the most effective solution, according to their belief, is to provide dialogues.
Right.
But in order, that's particularly the question now. If in order to realize an effective and inclusive dialogue, what would you do if the violence doesn't stop in Myanmar? And what we cannot see from for now is what is actually the plan for ASEAN and for the Indonesian government as the ASEAN chair to stop violence in order to dialogue to happen at the very first place. Whether and then the next question is whether the quiet diplomacy is enough. Yes, it's enough. Yes, it is necessary, but it is not sufficient to enable this kind of different condition that can lead to dialogue. So you have to have an effective pressures to the junta, and you have to have an effective acknowledgement that NUG is a significant political factors. That is one among the few that necessary condition that should be tackled by Indonesian chairmanship.
Right. Andrew, the choice of having a non-megaphone diplomacy, or rather the quiet diplomacy, do you think it's in line with the non-interference principle of ASEAN? We cannot interfere with the domestic dispute of one's ASEAN country, meaning that there is no other way for ASEAN to choose. Does it mean that we have to, in a way, rethink the ASEAN's principles of this non-interference principle to address the current political situation in Myanmar? Andrew? Well,
more or less, whether the quiet diplomacy is in line with the non-principle, I think in a larger context, yes, there are some association that the practice of quiet diplomacy has been in line with the ASEAN non-interference principles. Why? Because I think partially from the Indonesian government itself, there are some, there are some caution whether they want to engage every stakeholders openly in Myanmar or not. Because I think there are some hesitancy that by engaging in one particular groups in Myanmar that is being in conflict now, it can be seen as a move towards acknowledgement. It can be seen as a move towards legitimacy. But I think at the end of the day, President Jokowi has already mentioned that if we engage any particular actors in Myanmar, it doesn't mean acknowledgement. But you know, the thing about dialogue, it should be public eventually, right? That's the meaning of dialogue. That's all the political ethics and political
thinking. It should be out in the open for everyone to pay attention to.
There are some necessity that dialogue should be held openly, because everyone would have a reputational cost, right? And that reputational cost will somewhat create a condition to move the dialogue in order to become the force of the better argument at the end of the day.
That was exactly what President Jokowi said at the end of the summit during the presser event. Dialogue with all stakeholders in Myanmar, not only with the military junta, but does it mean with the pro-democracy part, the party that support probably Aung San Suu Kyi? How do you see this? Because as you mentioned, it's not an acknowledgement, be it for the military junta or either for the pro-democracy part of Myanmar.
Sure. Yes. If you want to engage the dialogue, there are some if you want to conduct a dialogue, there are some necessary steps that should be taken. Right. According to the 5-point consensus, the violence has to stop.
Yeah.
And then there should be a way for the humanitarian access could be delivered to the Myanmar people. The problem of the current condition is there are no significant progress for these 2 points. Even just few moments before the summit happens, there are attacks.
The humanitarian attack. There is no goodwill on the part of the military junta.
And the most crucial questions for now, yes, we need the quiet diplomacy, but how eventually we can transform from something that is being quiet into something that is being public, yet effective at the very first place. That's still a question. So therefore, we always insist that you have to come up with a plan. You have to come up with something that is in public effective in terms of making it as an ASEAN office, for example. So this plan office, and then the entire idea about how do you engage even in quiet or in public, they should be put into a great plan. So that's the thing that we haven't seen. And legitimacy is always at the end of the day public. So that's the question now.
Right. Minister Retno has said again and again, I attended in person the Foreign Affairs Ministers in Phnom Penh just last year under Cambodian's chairmanship, and now this year under Indonesia's chairmanship, that Myanmar has basically disinvited themselves to all of these high-level meetings of ASEAN, particularly the political high-level meeting. Meaning that, is this wise to disinvite Myanmar altogether, meaning that we're talking about them, but they're not here to clarify things for ASEAN and for ASEAN to make an informed decision on the matter?
Yes, that's also the hard question. If you want to conduct a truly dialogue, every party should be there, including the junta, including the NUG, and even the ethnic groups. And the question is, I don't think that ASEAN Leaders Summit is a platform for that. So that's why ASEAN has to be creative in conducting this kind of forum that could put everyone together at the very same place.
Not even on the sidelines of the summit, do you think?
It can be like that, but it has to be agreed it has to be agreed by all ASEAN member states. In the past, we know that there are some examples. For example, we hold this Jakarta informal dialogue during the Cambodian crisis and the Vietnam War. That was effective back then. And there are some merits to rethink that this kind of creativity is actually needed in today's situation. And there are also some ideas to ask for help for the extra regional powers like China, India, Japan, and US to facilitate that dialogue. But you know, every possibilities needs a better statesmanship, needs a better craft, and needs a better strategy. That's why you need a plan at the end of the day.
Right. Andrew, I have here on my note saying that CSIS has mentioned that Indonesian quiet diplomacy is a time-wasting strategy and addressing the situation, and identified ASEAN's growth is mainly supported by external parties. And you also piggyback on that we'll probably need ASEAN support from other external parties like Washington, Beijing, notable the two biggest economies in the world right now, and they are notably also dialogue partners of ASEAN, meaning that they're going to be saying something at the next, the 42nd summit in September, because that will be the Summit Plus. ASEAN plus US will be there, ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea will be there. So how do we expect these dialogue partners will have their say about the matter?
That's a tough question. How Indonesia should
something
do that.
We can predict from now.
Yes.
Let's say 6-7 months time.
Strongly, I wish that Indonesian government is being successful to engage everyone and to put every resources possible, both within the ASEAN and from the ASEAN and from the external ASEAN countries. But there are some issues with regards to whether it is a buying time strategy or not, because in the past there are tendency in previous ASEAN chair to expect that the next
and then they
chair,
just pass the torch over to the next chair, like Cambodian and Brunei Darussalam did in their previous chairmanship.
That's the problem, and we don't want that kind of problem to happen, because I think many people believe that it has to be Indonesia, because Indonesia is somewhat tacitly accepted as the leader of ASEAN, that Indonesia should better come up with the plan and so on and so forth. But you know, making a plan to engage everyone would be hard, especially if you look at the plan for the chairmanship today. There are 3 priorities, right? The ASEAN Matter things, and then the epicentrum for growth, and the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. The third part of the pillars has not been thoroughly tackled by the...
You mean the Indo-Pacific part?
The Indo-Pacific part, the translation of ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific.
ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific.
And I am afraid that the next summit will focus on that. We have so many summits and forums related to Indo-Pacific, ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, and things like that. So there would be so many agenda, and we really hope that Indonesian government is quite serious to think that Myanmar issues at the end of the day is still going to be a test for ASEAN itself and a test for the effective leadership of Indonesia in ASEAN.
Right, because there's always, in a way, a thorn on the side of our one in G20 presidency was Russia. Another thorn during chairmanship was Myanmar. So what lessons have we learned from our previous presidency that we can carry over to the chairmanship this year in addressing the Myanmar issue, Andrew? Because as we know, it's the global eyes of the global side communities towards ASEAN now, whether or not Indonesia's chairmanship can address these issues before ASEAN loses its respect in the global communities.
One thing that the Indonesian government has to understand as chair is the success would not happen this year. By all means, you cannot expect that the Myanmar issues is going to be resolved.
They don't seem to budge, do they?
Yes, so don't be afraid to be judged whether you can tackle the ASEAN issues now or not. The issues, I think the thing about ASEAN and Myanmar today is you have to have something that could be at the end of the day proven as a legacy of Indonesian government. There are some ways that Indonesia can do for the rest of the months following the next summit. First is they can focus to build the plan, as I mentioned earlier repeatedly, and then they also can focus to make a truly office of ASEAN. So, when dialogue partners even came to us, they still ask, which one is the office of the special envoy? Which one is the office for ASEAN in dealing with Myanmar? You can make it public. You can make the office public, and you can appoint which kind of who and which office would be responsible to deal with Myanmar issues. One thing that Indonesian government and ASEAN should understand at this particular moment is you need a long-term plan to deal with Myanmar issues, and that plan, this is something that we should do year following years, not this particular moment. So there would be no success whatsoever in knowing that Myanmar crisis is resolved.
Right. How would you describe, how would you illustrate this long-term plan, as you would say it, Andrew? Because we've had the 5-point consensus in place in the past 2 years. Myanmar didn't seem to budge, didn't seem even to respect, even blatant disrespect towards it, because there's always a major attack right before a major gathering of ASEAN high-level summits or leaders gathering. There's always something happening in Myanmar, just days or if not a week before that, showing just pure disregards to the 5-point consensus. So what other sort of long-term plans can we concoct here to achieve progress?
Well, if we want to talk about effective plans, it needs several things to happen. First, it needs a clear timeline. So when this is going to be reached, when the dialogue will happen, when the election will happen following the dialogues, and when the violence should stop. And the thing about the tricky parts about this is you really have to make sure that the Myanmar junta, comply to the plan, and they consult to the plan. That would be hard. So that's why plan is one thing, and engaging extra-regional powers like China, Japan, United States, and India is the second thing that you need to do, because you have to work with different agencies in order to make sure that the plan is being taken. And then with regards to plan, you have to have a best scenarios, the moderate scenarios, and the worst case scenarios. So,
but if we talk about the involvement in China, the new foreign minister of China just met with the leader of military junta, something that the previous foreign minister, Wang Yi, couldn't even manage to meet. And at that particular meeting, the new foreign minister of China has expressly conveyed his message that China will be in full backing of Myanmar's military junta efforts to do what they want to do, to supply weapons and everything else. So, meaning that it's going to be a dead-end conversation involving one of the biggest economies there. And I'd like to also point out the lack of crisis management that has been said by CSIS, crisis management mechanism in ASEAN in terms of dealing with conflicts within the regions. Do we need to take a more stern actions toward Myanmar, meaning that it will also be shifting the tone of the bloc towards a more militarized and possibly revanchist ASEAN? That's a strong word there.
Also, that's a too tough question. With regards to the possibility of China being close to Myanmar, it's kind of predictable, right? So that's why you have to tackle the issues from the very beginning. There was a crucial moment back then when I think China government is still trying to ensure that there are some stability and they have the good connection to Aung San Suu Kyi. And these kind of cards that if ASEAN was kind of quick at the very beginning, it can be taken as creative ideas. What do you need today is that China is close to the military. But you also at the same time, in order to create this kind of dialogue, you really have to know who's going to be close to NUG, and you can put it well and make another like Jakarta informal meeting or whatsoever. I think there are still room that can be played. And that leads to your second question, whether it would make ASEAN to be more militaristic. I think there is no way to make ASEAN to be militaristic.
The crisis it's just not the way of ASEAN.
The way to create this crisis management is capability is to first and foremost to understand that the principle of non-interference is not robust. It's not sacrosanct principle. This is something that you can take for granted as it is. There would be, there are so many literatures that proven that ASEAN principles of non-interference has been quite bargained from time to time. And I think it should be important for the Indonesian government to find the room. Yeah. To find the room that there are some historical records that made it possible. Yeah. There are some aspiration from the Indonesian domestic stakeholders that ASEAN should be more robust, should be more rule-based, and so on and so forth. And there are also some possibilities at the regional level. If you can put these three elements into a more effective diplomacy, I think the ASEAN can introduce some crisis management stipulation. It is not there in the charter, but there are some possibilities. For example, to understand, ASEAN is a consensus and consultation, right? Right. And we should focus more on the consultation. How do you translate the principle of consultation into a more effective crisis management? There are some ideas that I am afraid that cannot be,
We're going to be pressed for time for
That's
that.
True.
But in the meantime, we're going to leave it there. We're going to just to see how the dialogues will unfold, led by Indonesia's as a chair this year, and most importantly, how the summit at the end of the year, in just a couple of months, will transpire as well. I'd like to express my gratitude to Researcher, Department of International Relations of CSIS, Andrew Wiguna Mantong. It's been a pleasure having you in the studio.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andrew.